Next talk will actually be given by Ulrika Bloom-Pave. She is doing it in place of her student, I believe, clinical and biometrological characterization of female hair aging.
Thank you, Judge. Dear colleagues, it's my pleasure to present our study on female hair aging on behalf of the groups from Chicago and from my research center. And in fact, female hair aging is really difficult to investigate because we are all aware that most of the people do have some type of androgenetic alopecia or other types of alopecia. So in fact, the question is, we do know that aging is mainly influenced by intrinsic and extrinsic factors, and we really have to investigate this side of hair aging separately from aging phenomena, from other alopecia phenomena. So it's interesting that in fact it has only the normal age-related hair changes have only been reported in Asia so far. So and also David Whiting, who is really known to everybody, and he is the expert in histology, showed and presented in 2011 paper saying that in fact in senescence this is not due to miniaturization as we see in androgenetic alopecia, but in fact only of losing thick terminal hairs. So we are all aware in daily practice, senescence alopecia is quite often diagnosed as postmenopausal androgenetic alopecia or thinning of hair, and in fact quite often we are quite disappointed with the clinical outcomes as we treat them with what is available for androgenetic alopecia and other types. So in fact, our study aim was to develop in front of this background to better understand and characterize the aging phenomenon in scalp and hair shaft with clinical and instrumental evaluation on female women of 3 different age groups. We looked on a young group, here between 25 to 23, which were non-menopausal, of course, which are in the reproductive age, and then we looked on 2 old age groups here, which were postmenopausal. So we only included Caucasian patients, and we even looked on the photos of the family to be sure that neither a volunteer nor the family members had androgenetic alopecia or other types of alopecia. So there are the eligibility criteria. They were very thoroughly worked up to be sure that there are no other phenomenon disturbing exclusively the aging phenomenon investigation. So we used clinical methods, classical types of different growth parameters, thickness, dryness, scales, age-shaped trichotillomania by self-assessment and scales. And we did some biometrological evaluation, mainly focusing on different densities of white, total hair, thin hair, ratio of anagen telogen, and looked on the hair growth rate in the different age groups. And what was also important for us, because we think with the thinning of hair, quality of hair might change, we looked on mechanical properties by different mechanical testing and performed macrophotographic documentation by classical devices well known here as presented on the right side. So our population was in the young group about 28 years in the mean, in group 2 65, and in group 3 74 years of age. The clinical results showed us that in fact, interestingly, when you look over the age groups for density, scalp scaling, scalp dryness, you had an overall decrease, but in fact no significant differences, albeit they were quite different from age in the mean. Also, there was no claimable difference of the hair thickness present, or at least it was not significant in the groups we investigated. Looking for a normal scalp without any disease, we looked also for itching and trichodynia, as we are aware that is quite often problems of our patients at consultation. We used a visual analog scale. The values were relatively low on the lower limit of the visual scale, or the lower range, and there were between the age group no significant difference. And in fact, so global scalp and hair conditions decrease in non-alopecia population, but not that much that it comes to difference even between the young and the older groups. Looking for white hair, and when we take white hair, it's really the bright white hair, it's not the salt and pepper hair, the gray hair, and it is obvious that of course it increases with the age and the older, it's highly significantly, but what's interesting is that we do have a difference between the central parietal area and the occipital. We look all parameters always on these two areas, and to be sure that on the one hand you have the central parietal part and the occiput to see whether there's clinical differences or also biometrological differences, because quite often in diseases, as we see also in terminal hair, you have a significant difference between central parietal and occipital. So you have a significant increase of white hair with age, but clearly higher on the central parietal part than on the occiput. So you have region-dependent differences, possibly indicating also differences in melanocyte activity. When we look on terminal hair density, we know from androgenetic alopecia that this is the way around, that you have lower levels on the frontal area or the central parietal area and higher on the occiput. And in the normal population, you clearly see a higher density in the central parietal compared to the occiput, and you have a significant decrease over time of terminal hair. And also, what's interesting, also the thin hair. So it's not only terminal hair miniaturizing to thin hair, but the absolute number of thin hair also in those areas are decreasing. But here we do have, and this is over the young group compared to the older groups, we do have a significant reduction on both regions and of both types of hair, terminal and thin hair. So there is a significant decrease of both diameter type hairs with age in both areas. And when we look at the growth rate, we could think that the growth rate decreases with age and we have lower growth rate activity. But in fact, when you see there is a significant difference here, but quite low, and it still stays even over the age in a quite normal range of hair growth activity. So the hair remaining, they grow with a comparable growth rate. However, you have a reduced number of terminal and thin hair, but overall, so the volume of the overall is significantly lower. So the impression, and you have a lower density overall of the scalp. And we showed also that the diameter of the hair overall is lower. So in fact, the decrease of hair growth is there, but not as important that it can claim to be responsible. And you see it also if you look on the anagen-telogen ratio, you have a decline on the time in both areas investigated. But however, it's not significant if you look at the percentage on these areas and the percentage on telogen. So in fact, the ratio of active hair follicles remaining on the scalp is still comparable over the age groups. So I think this is quite interesting, so that we can understand better mechanisms in female hair aging. But what is making our hair so different when we are aging? It's not only the color, but we are looking also on physical properties. And when looking on typical extension tests and looking on break extension and posterior trimming, we looked on a cross-sectional area and elastic modules. We could show that in fact the break stress is really showing a significant decrease from the young to the old groups, and even this 10-year difference in the mean age shows that there's even between the two old groups a significant differences in hair breakage. So in fact, the quality of the hair shaft is significantly altered, and we do have a weakening of the hair fiber with age, and even rapidly decreasing when in the older groups. So the main change in the aging phenomenon, as we see it also on our skin, the quality of the keratin produced is the changing of the surface also and of the porosity, because when you look on porosity and swelling, you have a significant age group increase here, and this is, of course, more apparent in the central parietal area, but in fact it's also a loss of quality of hair in the aging. So in conclusion, when you look on female hair aging in normal, non-alopecia female population, you can investigate intrinsic and extrinsic aging phenomenon, and it's present in the aged population, maybe with an overall reduction of tone and as well of thin hair. You have a relatively stable anagen-telogen ratio and a decrease of the hair growth rate, but not that significant. And that's the main finding, is that you have a structural and mechanical deterioration of the hair shaft strength and resistance, and in fact a weakening of the hair fiber and loss of the barrier function with a damage of the cuticle. So overall, we have to take into account when we treat patients, elderly patients, that in fact female hair aging must be further elucidated and better understood, in fact to develop preventive targeted treatments and supportive treatments of the hair shaft structure. And in fact, when we treat our patient postmenopausal pattern hair loss, like androgenetic alopecia, what we quite often see in postmenopausal women and senescent alopecia are two different phenomena. However, of course, also in female pattern hair loss, you have overlay of both diseases, but they must be handled as two distinct entities, and also perhaps you can combine the treatments, but it's important to understand the phenomenon of aging and the impact of aging on hair structure and quality. Thank you for your attention, and I would just like to thank the team, the whole team, the Piazzaro team who did all the analysis for physical properties, and then my team here who recruited the patient and who looked at all the family photos, and it took us quite a while to find females without androgenetic alopecia, without having this normal hair quality in the aged population. So thank you for your attention.
Open for discussion.
Thank you, dear Professor, for a beautiful talk. I have a small question. I noticed that the majority of patients of yours showed increased, maybe, telogen ratio above 15%. Like slightly pushing it towards a group of chronic telogen effluvium. Do you think it might have some influence on the hair thinning, I mean, in the matter of time?
You're correct for the numbers, but this was trichoscan method. In the trichoscan method, you always have higher as with trichogram. So it's not, I would say, if I compare it to my androgenetic or diffuse effluvium, you look for it. Pool test was negative, this was clear. We looked at thyroid disorders, we eliminated other causes, and nobody has active diffuse effluvium. And the telogen rate was measured really as a device, and I would say we all know that it's higher in this. So the mean is higher and of the telogen rate. So this is not a pathological telogen rate, but it's due to the device. Thank you.
Beautiful study. I have to admit that until you gave this talk, I wasn't even sure whether senescent alopecia is just a figment of our imagination. So the only set of data that I find totally convincing that maybe it is something separate is that the androgen-telogen ratio has not really changed, because that you would expect in female pattern balding. But this distinction between the two entirely depends on that you can with 100% certainty exclude that there was at least a very early stage of female pattern balding. And the criteria that you use, I think they're the best you could use, but they're not 100% certain. There could still be an impact of androgens and relative lack of estrogens, and until we can somehow objectively exclude this, we will never be 100% certain.
You can never purify this population. Also, of course, you could say genetic intrinsic factors are different in each subject. Extrinsic, they had a different life, but perhaps the effect of UV also on the central parietal part is important. I think there are so many confounding factors. However, it's an approach to categorize and to define it, because we are all using this term senescent alopecia. But I what we would like to show is, in fact, we have this aging phenomenon of the hair. And I think the most convincing for me is the physical testing of the porosity, of the different swelling capacities, of the increased hair breakage. So in fact, it's perhaps not, it's a reduction in active hair follicles overall, and you don't see this phenomenon of physical disturbances in androgenetic alopecia. But of course it's compounded, but in 65-year-old women, you should see at least a clinical pattern of androgenetic alopecia when it's really androgenetic alopecia. Okay?
Thank you very much, thanks.
So,
Thanks.
so